Today's episode, Bigfoot Wallace, the Mier Expedition, and the Black Bean Death Lottery in 2 parts. Today, Part 2, Bigfoot Wallace and the Black Bean Death Lottery. As we learned in Part 1 of the events leading to the Black Bean incident, the ill-fated Mier Expedition into Mexico resulted in the Texian volunteers being captured by Mexican forces and ultimately being sentenced to a lottery, resulting in the execution by firing squad of every 10th Texian in the group. Here's Bigfoot's description of the drawing of the beans from the Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace, the Texas Ranger and Hunter, by his best friend John C. Duvall, from Notes of Bigfoot Wallace. Quote, "It was determined that the 17 men to be executed should be selected by lottery, and in a little while a squad of Mexican officers came into the corral, preceded by a soldier bearing an earthen vessel, which he placed upon a low stone wall bounding the far side of the corral, and which was intended to hold a number of white and black beans, corresponding to the number of men and officers in our command. The Mexican officers stationed themselves near the earthen pot to overlook and superintend the lottery and see that everyone had a fair chance for his life. One of them then proceeded to count out so many white beans, which he poured into the vessel, and then dropped in the fatal 17 black ones on top of them, covering the whole with a thick napkin or cloth. We were then formed into a line and drawn up in front of the low wall on which the earthen pot had been placed. Before the drawing began, they informed us that if any man drew out more than one bean, and either of them should prove a black one, he would be regarded as having drawn a black one solely and be shot accordingly. Our commissioned officers were ordered to draw first. Captain Cameron stepped forward and without the slightest visible trepidation put his hand under the cloth and drew out a white bean. He had observed when the Mexican officer put the beans in the pot that he poured the white in first and the black ones on top of them and then set it down without shaking, possibly with the intention of forcing as large a number as possible of the black beans upon our commissioned officers who were to have the first drawing. When he returned to his place in the line, he whispered to those nearest him, "Dig deep, boys." And by following his advice, all the officers drew white beans except Captain Eastland. After all the officers had drawn, the muster rolls of the men were produced, and we were called forward as our names appeared upon them. Some of the Mexican officers present were evidently much affected by the courage and nonchalance manifested by the men in this fiery trial. Others, on the contrary, seemed to enjoy the whole proceedings hugely, particularly one little swarthy baboon-visaged chap that looked as if he had subsisted all his life on a short allowance of red pepper and cigaritos. He appeared to take a special delight in the hesitation of some of the men when they put their hands into the vessel, for even the bravest felt some reluctance to draw when he knew that life or certain death depended upon the color of the bean he might select. Whenever there was the slightest hesitation, this little officer would say, in apparently the most commiserating tone, "Take your time, my child. Don't hurry yourself. Be careful, my poor fellow. You know if you get a black bean, you'll be taken out and shot in 10 minutes, a fact we had already been fully apprised of. Ah, that's unfortunate," he would say when a poor fellow drew a black bean, "but better luck to you next time." Yet, all the while he was talking in this way in the kindest accents, a devilish grin on his baboon face indicated the great pleasure he took in the anxiety and distress of these poor fellows. Those who drew black beans seemed to care very little about it. Occasionally one would remark as he drew out the fatal color, "Well, boys, the jig is up with me," or, "They've taken my sign in at last," or something of a similar character, and then give way to the next, apparently as unconcerned as if he had no interest whatsoever in what was going on around him. There was but a single exception to this. One poor fellow, a messmate of mine too, appeared to be completely overcome by his apprehensions of drawing a black bean. He stood until his own time to draw came round, wringing his hands and moaning audibly and continually telling those near him that he knew he should draw a black bean, that he had a presentiment such would be his fate. When his turn came, he hung back and absolutely refused to go up at all, until a file of Mexican soldiers forced him forward at the point of their bayonets. He hesitated so long after he put his hand into the vessel containing the beans that a Mexican officer near him pricked him severely with his sword to make him withdraw it. All this, of course, was immediately gratifying to the little baboon-faced official, who poor-fellowed him in his kindest tones all the while, though evidently snickering and laughing in his sleeve at the fears exhibited by the poor fellow. At last the poor fellow was forced to withdraw his hand, and his presentiment proved too true, for in it he held the fatal black bean. He turned deadly pale as his eyes rested upon it, but apparently he soon resigned himself to his inevitable fate, for he never uttered a word of complaint afterward. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart. My name, beginning with W, was, of course, among the last on the roll, and when it came to my turn to draw, so many more white beans than black had been drawn out in proportion that there could have been no great difference in the number of each. I observed 24 white beans drawn out in succession. The chances of life and death for me were therefore not so very unequal. I will frankly confess, when I put my hand into the pot and this fact reoccurred to my mind, a spasm of fear or dread sent a momentary chill to my heart. But I mastered it quickly, and before even the lynx eye of the little baboon-faced official detected any sign of such weakness. At any rate, he bestowed none of his endearing epithets upon me. All the time the drawing had been going on, I stood pretty close to the scene of operations, and I thought I could perceive a slight difference in the size of the black and white beans, that the former were a shade larger than the latter. This difference, I know, may have been purely imaginary, but at any rate, I was eventually decided by it in my choice of a bean. When I first put my hand in the pot, I took up several beans at once in my fingers and endeavored to distinguish their color by the touch, but they all felt precisely alike. I then dropped them and picked up 2 more, and after fingering them carefully for an instant, I thought that one of them seemed a little larger than the other. I dropped that one like a hot potato and drew out the one left. It was a white one, of course, or I should not now be here to tell my story, but not a very white one. And when I cast my eyes upon it, it looked to me as black as the ace of spades. I felt certain for a moment that my fate was sealed. But when I handed it to the Mexican officer who received them as they were drawn out, I saw that he put it on the wall with the white beans and not into his waistcoat pocket as he had done with the black ones. I knew then that I was safe, and the revulsion of feeling was so great and rapid that I can compare it to nothing except the sudden lifting of an immense weight from off one's shoulders. I felt as light as a feather, though I weighed at least 170 pounds net, after all my hardship and starvation, exclusive of the remnant of clothing I had on me. Among the last to draw was an Irishman by the name of W, a fellow noted for his wit and humor as well as for his reckless daredevil character. He put his hand into the pot and, feeling around, discovered that there were few beans left in it. "Ah, now, my hinnies," he said, "and is this the way you would try to deceive an innocent man to his destruction? Faith, and there's not a dozen beans left in the pot, and I'll not draw one at all." He was ordered to take one out immediately. "Oh, it's for murthering me ye are, ye bloody spalpeens," said Pat. "Without judge or jury, I see that as plain as the nose on my face. Yes, let the ither men pick and choose as it suited 'em out of scores of beans, and now there isn't a dozen left in the pot, and I've no choice scarcely at all. Devil take such a lottery, I say, but I suppose there's no help for it, so here goes." And Pat drew forth his bean, and everybody, even the Mexican officers themselves, I believe, were rejoiced when it proved to be a white one. "There," said Pat, handing the bean to the officer. It was a black one, but I offered up a short prayer to St. Patrick, you see, and in the twinkling of an eye he converted it into a white one. Hooray for St. Patrick and old Ireland forever! When the drawing was completed, the white and black beans were carefully counted over again, and the number found to tally with those of the men. Those that had drawn black beans were kept separate from the rest of us, and in a few moments after the drawing was concluded, they were marched off in 2 squads, and shortly afterward, repeated volleys of musketry were heard, and we knew that their cares and troubles were forever ended in this world. One of them, however, a man by the name of Shepherd, as we learned subsequently, made a most miraculous escape for the time being. When they were fired upon by the guard, Shepherd fell and pretended to be dead, though in fact he was only slightly wounded. He was left on the ground with the dead bodies of his companions, and when night came, he got up and went off without being observed. The next morning, when the Mexicans examined the bodies again, they were greatly astonished to find that one was missing and could not be accounted satisfactorily in any way. Shepherd wandered around for several weeks without being recaptured, but at length he was discovered, taken back to Saltillo, and shot to death in the public square, and his body carried out and left unburied on the commons. The next morning we took up the line of march for San Luis Potosi, but before leaving the dreary old rancho, we were taken out and drawn up in a line in front of the bloody and stiffened forms of our murdered companions. For what purpose this was, I do not know, unless it was to inspire us with a wholesome dread of a similar fate, should we ever attempt to rise upon our guard again. So ends Bigfoot's description of the black bean episode, but there's more to the story. After being assigned to do road work in Mexico City for the summer of 1843, the Texians were transferred to the dreaded Perote prison. Bigfoot was finally released on September 16, 1844. He arrived back in Texas in December, after an absence of more than 2 years. The source for this podcast was the Library of Congress, The Adventures of Big Foot Wallace, the Texas Ranger and Hunter, written by Bigfoot's best friend, John C. Duvall, from notes provided by Bigfoot himself. This book is in the public domain. This has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. Check out my novel, Gone to Dallas, the Storekeeper, 1856 to 1861. It's a historical novel of Texas and a woman's adventure rolled into one. Also, watch for my new novel coming in 2024, Queen of Cotton, Confederate Camel Caravan across Texas. Thanks for listening. Y'all come back.